Fine, let's start. Number 1. The Hueyatlaco Site. Near the town of Valsequillo, in the Mexican state of Puebla, a shallow, prehistoric lakeshore turned into the most explosive dating controversy in the history of the Americas. In the 1960s, an American archaeologist named Cynthia Irwin Williams led an excavation there. Her team pulled stone tools out of the ground, and those tools were lying right beside the butchered bones of extinct animals. There were bifaces, scrapers, projectile points, and burins. Everything looked like a clean, ancient kill site. Then the geologists arrived, and the story stopped making sense. A young United States Geological Survey scientist named Virginia Steen McIntyre joined the project, along with Harold Mauld and Roald Fryxell. They dated the layer that held the tools using 4 independent methods. They used uranium series dating, fission track dating, tephra-hydration, and mineral weathering studies. 4 different clocks, 4 different techniques, and the 4 clocks agreed. They pointed to an age of about 250,000 years. You have to understand why that number was impossible. In the 1960s, mainstream science was locked into the Clovis first model. That model said the first humans reached the Americas around 12,000 years ago. The Hueyatlaco date was off by a factor of 20. It did not just push the timeline back, it detonated it. What happened next was not really about science. Steen McIntyre later said that publishing those dates ended her career. She said she was branded unreliable and could not find steady academic work. Cynthia Irwin Williams distanced herself from the extreme old dates, and the team fractured from the inside. Fission track testing on volcanic zircon crystals returned some younger numbers in later runs, and the argument never ended. Mainstream researchers offered a way out. They suggested the artifacts had been washed by water into much older sediments, mixing young tools with ancient ground. The defenders answered that the tools showed no water-rolling wear at all, and that they sat in undisturbed, fine-grained lake beds. In 2004, a researcher named Sam Van Landingham used fossil diatoms to argue the sediments really were that old. No human bones were ever found at Hueyatlaco, only tools and animal bone, so no one could test the site against a skeleton. Today, the consensus still treats that 250,000-year age as contamination rather than truth. But the case never died. And if the ground can hide a number that large, the question becomes simple. What else is waiting in the dark, underwater, where almost no one can reach it? Number 2. Naia, the Ice Age Girl. In 2007, cave divers slipped into a flooded tunnel system near Tulum on Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula and swam into a vast underground pit. The chamber sits about 40 meters, or 130 feet, below the modern water table. At the bottom, resting on a ledge in the black water, was the skeleton of a teenage girl. They named her Naia, after the water nymphs of Greek myth. Naia was about 15 or 16 years old when she died. She is one of the oldest and most complete human skeletons ever found anywhere in the Americas, dated to roughly 12 to 13,000 years ago. To pin that age down, scientists radiocarbon dated her tooth enamel and used uranium-thorium dating on the calcite crusts that had slowly grown over her bones underwater. During the last ice age, this chamber was not flooded. Sea levels were far lower, and the pit was a dry, deep shaft in the dark. It worked as a natural trap. Around Naia, divers found the bones of at least 26 large animals, including Ice Age elephants called gomphotheres, giant ground sloths, and saber-toothed cats. They had all fallen into the same stone throat and never climbed out. The find was published in the journal Science in 2014 by a team led by James Chatters, the same archaeologist who had been central to the famous Kennewick Man case. And Naia answered a question that had puzzled researchers for decades. Her mitochondrial DNA belonged to haplogroup D1, a genetic lineage that traces back to Beringia, the land bridge between Asia and Alaska. That lineage links her directly to modern Native Americans. Here is why that mattered. Naia had a narrow skull and a projecting face, very different from the rounder skulls of later Native Americans. Some scientists had used that difference to argue the earliest Americans were a separate people who were later replaced. Naia's DNA proved otherwise. They were the same lineage. The face simply changed shape over thousands of years. This solved what researchers called the Paleo-American paradox. She probably died searching for water in total darkness, plunging around 30 meters onto the chamber floor. Her pelvis was fractured, exactly what you would expect from a fatal fall. Then, about 10,000 years ago, the rising seas flooded the chamber and sealed everything inside. In 2016, divers reported that some of her bones had been disturbed or removed by unknown hands. But not everyone in these pits fell by accident. Some animals were driven there, and some were killed on purpose. Number 3. Little Salt Spring. In southwest Florida, near the town of Northport, there's an hourglass-shaped sinkhole owned by the University of Miami. It plunges about 78 meters, or 256 feet, straight down. A wide, shallow basin narrows into a deep, dark shaft. And on a ledge inside that shaft, divers found something that looks like a frozen murder scene from 12,000 years ago. It was an extinct giant land tortoise, a creature called Hesperotestudo, and it had been killed with a sharpened wooden stake driven straight through its shell. The stake was fire-hardened wood. Whoever killed this animal flipped it onto its back and cooked it in place, on its own shell, on a ledge inside the sinkhole. This is among the oldest evidence of humans hunting and preparing food anywhere in North America. The site was first investigated in the 1970s by archaeologist Carl Clausen, and later studied for decades by John Gifford of the University of Miami. What makes Little Salt Spring so extraordinary is the water itself. Deep down, the water holds almost no oxygen. And without oxygen, the bacteria that normally rot away wood and flesh cannot do their work. So organic material survives that should have vanished thousands of years ago. Divers recovered a wooden throwing stick, essentially a non-returning boomerang, along with other perishable tools. Objects like that almost never survived from the Paleo-Indian era. During the Ice Age, when Florida's water table dropped, this sinkhole was one of the only reliable watering holes for miles. Animals and people climbed down to reach the receding water on ledges about 26 meters below the surface. Some of them never made it back up. Later, during the Archaic period, around 6,000 to 5,000 years ago, a huge cemetery formed in the wetland slough around the spring. And here the preservation turns almost unbelievable. Researchers have recovered preserved human brain matter from some of those burials, the same eerie phenomenon seen at the famous Wendover site. The extinct animals found here include ground sloths, mammoths, and the giant tortoise. Hesperotestudo was slow, nearly a meter long, and easy prey once cornered. The fire-hardened point of that killing stake was deliberate technology, shaped to punch through a tough shell. Radiocarbon dates on the stake and the tortoise cluster tightly around 12,000 years ago. The still, dark, low-oxygen water makes this one of the most important underwater archaeological sites on the continent. But dry caves preserve the dead in a very different way, and they breed much stranger legends. Number 4. The Lovelock Cave Mummies. In the Humboldt Sink of northwestern Nevada, on the old shoreline of a vanished Ice Age lake, there is a dry rock shelter called Lovelock Cave. Its story is a collision between a real, sophisticated culture and one of the most sensational legends in American folklore. In 1911, the cave was not treated as a treasure. It was mined for bat guano, which makes excellent fertilizer. Two miners, David Pugh and James Hart, shoveled out roughly 250 tons of guano, and in the process, they destroyed and discarded countless artifacts and human remains. Only after the damage was done did archaeologists arrive. L. Loud ran salvage work in 1912, and Mark Harrington followed in 1924. Even after the destruction, the cave yielded thousands of artifacts spanning about 4,000 years. There were baskets, sandals, and, most famously, duck decoys made from tule reeds and feathers. Those decoys are about 2,000 years old, and they are the oldest known decoys anywhere in the world. The cave also held naturally mummified human remains, and some of that preserved hair looked reddish in color. That reddish hair is where science and legend split. Scientists explain the color as a chemical change that happens to dark hair after death. But the local northern Paiute have an old tradition about the Siteka, a race of red-haired cannibalistic giants who once lived in the region. According to the legend, the Paiute and their allies drove these giants into a cave and lit fires at the entrance, killing them all. And excavations really did find a layer of burning and ash, which believers point to as proof. Stories spread of giant skeletons and enormous sandals, some said to be over 38 centimeters or 15 inches long. But here the evidence runs dry. No scientifically documented giant skeletons from Lovelock exist in any museum collection. The measured remains fall within the normal human range. The oversized sandals are more plausibly ceremonial, or worn over other footwear. The real people of Lovelock belong to the Lovelock culture, marsh-dwelling hunter-gatherers who lived off birds, fish, and tule. Analysis of their preserved waste, called coprolites, confirms a diet heavy in waterfowl and marsh plants. The guano mining wrecked the site's layering before science could read it properly, which is exactly why the wild theories still thrive. Arguably, the truth, the world's oldest decoys and a clever wetland culture, is more remarkable than the myth. From a desert legend, we move to a prairie cliff soaked in real, provable death. Number 5. Head smashed in Buffalo Jump. At the foot of the Porcupine Hills in southwestern Alberta, Canada, there is a sandstone cliff with a name that sounds like a horror film. Head smashed in Buffalo Jump. It is one of the oldest, largest, and best preserved buffalo jumps in North America, and it was used for about 6,000 years. In 1981, it was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The horror is in the ground. At the base of the cliff, the deposit of crushed bison bone is up to about 10 meters, or 33 feet, deep. That is 6,000 years of mass death compressed into a single hillside. The cliff itself stands about 10 to 18 meters high at the kill point. This was not chaos. It was engineering. The ancestors of the Blackfoot people drove entire herds of bison along carefully built pathways called drive lanes. More than 12,000 stone cairns mark those lanes, stretching for several kilometers across the gathering basin behind the cliff. Young hunters known as buffalo runners disguise themselves in wolf hides and calf hides. One would imitate a lost calf to draw the herd forward, while others in wolfskins spook the animals from behind. The name comes from a Blackfoot legend. A young man is said to have stood beneath the cliff to watch the bison rain down, and he was crushed against the rock, his skull smashed. Below the drop, a butchering camp processed the carcasses for meat, hide, sinew, horn, and bone marrow. Nothing was wasted. The hunt demanded a deep understanding of bison behavior, of wind direction, of the shape of the land, and it required large numbers of people working in perfect coordination. A single successful drive could kill dozens, even hundreds, of animals at once. Excavations revealed distinct layers of bone separated by wind-blown soil, and each layer records a separate hunt across the centuries. Archaeologist Brian Reeves established the site's 6,000-year sequence. The stone tools tell their own story of change. The projectile points shift over time, from the larger tips used with the atlatl, or spear thrower, to the smaller points used with the bow and arrow. The site literally records the moment one weapon replaced another. There are even stone-boiling pits used to render grease out of bone, a labor-intensive way to make a rich, calorie-dense food. In 1987, an interpretive center was built into the cliff itself, run in partnership with the Blackfoot. Communal jumping only ended when the horse and the gun arrived. But some catastrophes were never planned, and one of them buried an entire village alive. Number 6. The Ozette Village. On the Pacific coast of Washington state, at Cape Alava on the Olympic Peninsula, there was a Maka whaling village called Ozette. Around the year 1750, a massive mudslide roared down and buried part of that village in an instant, sealing several cedar plank longhouses under a wall of wet clay. The people inside had no warning. That sudden burial should have been the end of the story. Instead, it created a miracle of preservation. The clay was so dense and so free of oxygen that it stopped decay in its tracks. Wood, baskets, and cloth that would normally rot away in a few seasons survived for more than 2 centuries. Archaeologists nicknamed the site the American Pompeii. Ozette stayed hidden until 1970, when storm erosion cut into the bank and exposed wooden artifacts sticking out of the ground. Richard Daugherty of Washington State University led the excavation from 1970 to 1981, working hand in hand with the Maka tribe. What they pulled out of the mud was staggering. Roughly 55,000 artifacts were recovered, an almost unheard of trove of perishable material. There were cedar storage boxes, baskets, woven mats, harpoon shafts, bentwood fishhooks, and even looms. One of the most famous finds was a carved block of cedar in the shape of a whale's dorsal fin, inlaid with more than 700 sea otter teeth. Textiles woven from cedar bark and dog hair survived intact. The mud had sealed the houses so completely that house planks, sleeping platforms, and hearths were all found exactly where they had stood. Whale and seal bones confirmed what the Maka had always said in their oral history, that they were open ocean whalers who hunted from cedar canoes. The site turned traditional knowledge into physical proof. Excavating it required special wet site techniques, using gentle streams of pressurized water to wash away the mud without shattering the fragile wood underneath. The artifacts are now curated at the Maka Cultural and Research Center in Naia Bay. Ozette had been continuously occupied for at least 2,000 years before the disaster. Dating places the deadly mudslide in the early to mid-1700s. What triggered it? It may have been heavy rain saturating the slope. But there is a darker suspect. In the year 1700, a gigantic Cascadia subduction zone earthquake struck this coast, and that violent shaking is a leading candidate for the slope failure that entombed Ozette. The Maka's control over their own excavation became a landmark in respectful, collaborative archaeology. But not every buried victim is human. Some were butchered giants at the bottom of a river. Number 7. Page-Ladson. Back in Florida, in the tannin-stained water of the Osceola River, there is a site that sits about 8 meters, or 26 feet underwater, and it helped break one of archaeology's most stubborn rules. It is named Page-Ladson, after a diver named Buddy Page who reported it, and the Ladson family who owned nearby land. The site is a sinkhole in the riverbed, filled with fine sediment that seals out oxygen and preserves organic material. It was first worked in the 1980s and 1990s by David Webb, and then reinvestigated between 2012 and 2014 by Jesse Halligan and Michael Waters. What they found was a mastodon tusk covered in cut marks, lying with stone tools. Those cut marks were not random. They ran in parallel lines, exactly consistent with stone tools slicing to remove the tusk from its socket, possibly for the edible tissue at its base, or for the ivory itself. And when the team dated the layer, the number was startling. The human activity here happened about 14,550 years ago. That is roughly 1,500 years before the Clovis culture, the people once thought to be the very first Americans. A biface, a two-sided stone knife, was found in the same secure layer of sediment, dated by the organic material around it. The excavation also recovered mastodon dung preserved in the sinkhole, which let scientists reconstruct the ancient environment. They even tracked spores of a fungus called Sporormiella, which grows on the dung of large plant eaters, to figure out when the local megafauna died off. Now picture the work itself. These divers operate in near total darkness, in coffee-colored water, in a river where alligators drift past. They cannot simply dig. They fan the sediment away by hand, inch by inch, and bag every find underwater. It is slow, dangerous, and painstaking. In 2016, the results were published in the journal Science Advances by Halligan, Waters, and their colleagues, confirming the pre-Clovis dates with modern rigor. The find added powerful weight to a growing idea that people were living in the Americas long before the Clovis first model ever allowed. The Osceola River cuts through limestone that is riddled with sinkholes and springs. During the Ice Age, this stretch was dry land or shallow ponds, drawing mastodons, the forest-browsing cousins of mammoths, and the humans who hunted them. Page-Ladson rewrote the calendar through a single butchered tusk, but some sites rewrote it not through their finds, but through their sheer, impossible age. Number 8. Watson Break. In northeastern Louisiana, near the city of Monroe, there's a ring of 11 earthen mounds connected by low ridges. It is called Watson Break, and when its true age was confirmed in the 1990s, it forced archaeologists to tear up their textbooks. Watson Break was built about 5,400 years ago, around 3,500 years before the Common Era. That makes it the oldest known mound complex in all of North America. It predates the more famous Poverty Point site by roughly 1,900 years. Let that sink in. It is older than the Great Pyramid of Egypt. It is older than Stonehenge. And it was standing in Louisiana while those monuments were still nothing but ideas. The complex forms an oval about 280 meters, or 920 feet, across, with mounds rising as high as about 7.5 meters, or 25 feet. But the real shock is not the age alone. It is who built it. Watson Break was raised by hunter-gatherers, not farmers, mobile foragers who lived off the seasonal bounty of the Ouachita River floodplain. For a long time, archaeologists believed that monumental construction required agriculture. The logic seemed obvious. You need farming to produce a food surplus, and a surplus to feed the workers who build big things, and a settled society to organize them. Watson Break broke that chain of reasoning completely. The site was studied and dated by archaeologist Joe Saunders and his colleagues, whose paper in the journal Science in 1997 announced its antiquity to a stunned field. Construction happened in stages over several centuries. Early low mounds were later heightened and joined by ridges, and crucially, there is no evidence of elite burials or a chiefly hierarchy inside those mounds. No kings, no rulers. The purpose was more likely social or ceremonial, a place to gather. Archaeologists found fired clay cooking objects, stone tools, and the debris of tool-making. They also found tiny geometric stone beads and drilled ornaments, hinting at craft specialists among the builders. The people ate fish, shellfish, deer, and wild plants like goosefoot and knotweed following the seasons. The mounds were raised basket load by basket load of soil, representing an enormous investment of labor by a society with no bosses and no farms. They did not live there year-round. They gathered seasonally, to build and to socialize. Watson Break proved that complex, coordinated construction came thousands of years before agriculture in the Americas, and earthworks can be read like calendars, especially one that coils across a ridge like a giant serpent aimed at the sun. Number 9. The Serpent Mound. In Adams County, in southern Ohio, an enormous snake made of earth crawls across a wooded ridge. The Great Serpent Mound stretches about 411 meters, or 1,348 feet, long which makes it the largest serpent effigy in the world. And almost everything about it is a mystery, starting with the ground it sits on. The mound rests on the rim of a strange geological structure, a buried crater. It was formed either by an ancient meteorite impact or by a violent underground explosion called a crypto-explosion, hundreds of millions of years ago. Whatever created it left the bedrock shattered and disturbed. Some researchers think that broken, unusual ground is exactly why ancient people saw the place as sacred. The serpent's head aligns with the sunset on the summer solstice, and its winding coils are argued to line up with other solar events, the solstices and the equinoxes. At the head, the open jaws seem to be swallowing a hollow oval. People have argued about that oval for over a century. Is it an egg, the sun, a frog, a giant eye? No one knows. Dating the mound is almost impossible, because the serpent contains no burials and no artifacts inside its body. There is nothing buried in it to test. Two cultures are the main suspects. There is the Adena culture, which lived here from about 800 years before the Common Era to about 100 of the Common Era. And there is the later Fort Ancient culture, from about 1000 to 1600 of the Common Era. In 1991, radiocarbon dating of charcoal from the mound pointed to the Fort Ancient culture around the year 1070. That date is intriguing because it falls close to two spectacular sky events: the appearance of Halley's Comet in the year 1066, and a brilliant supernova that lit up the sky in the year 1054. Some researchers wonder if the serpent was a response to something people saw burning in the heavens. But the debate did not end. In 2014, a new study argued for a much earlier Adena origin, around 300 years before the Common Era. And the nearby conical burial mounds are firmly Adena, which muddies the question further. The site was rescued from destruction between 1885 and 1900, when Frederick Ward Putnam of Harvard raised the funds and the Peabody Museum acquired it. Today, it is an Ohio State Memorial and a National Historic Landmark. Its snake symbolism echoes in later Native American cosmology, and some read the coil as a calendar in Earth. But some finds are less about mystery and more about one single, undeniable proof frozen inside a bone. Number 10. The Folsom Site. Near the town of Folsom, in northeastern New Mexico, in a dry gully called Wild Horse Arroyo, one discovery settled a question that had divided science for generations. And it began with a man history almost forgot. In 1908, a heavy flood tore through the arroyo. A cowboy named George McJunkin, who had been born into slavery and freed as a child, was riding the fence line when he spotted large bones sticking out of the newly cut arroyo wall. McJunkin was largely self-taught, but he had taught himself geology and astronomy, and he knew at once that these bones were bigger and older than any cow. He reported the find again and again for years. He died in 1922, before anyone came to dig, never knowing what he had started. The bones belonged to Bison antiquus, an extinct Ice Age bison, a beast roughly 15 to 25% larger than the modern American buffalo. Excavation finally began in 1926, under the Colorado Museum of Natural History, now the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And in 1927, they found it. A finely made stone spear point lodged between the ribs of one of those extinct bison. It was sitting in the bone. There was no way to fake it, and no way to argue it away. That single point changed everything. Before Folsom, mainstream science insisted humans had been in the Americas for only a few thousand years. But here was a human weapon buried in an animal that had gone extinct more than 10,000 years earlier. The two had to be the same age. Archaeologists, including Jesse Figgins and the famous fossil hunter Barnum Brown, verified the point right where it lay, and they invited skeptics to come and see it still locked in the ground. The weapon became the definition of a type, the Folsom point, a thin, elegant point with a channel flake removed from each face, a feature called fluting, making them took extraordinary skill, and many points snapped during manufacture. Folsom points date to roughly 10,800 to 10,200 radiocarbon years ago, about 12,500 calendar years. They were the weapons of communal bison hunts across the Great Plains. The Folsom discovery launched the entire field of American Paleo-Indian archaeology, and it was soon followed by even older Clovis finds nearby in the 1930s. George McJunkin is now honored as the true discoverer. The image of a stone weapon locked forever between the ribs of an extinct beast is still one of archaeology's most powerful proofs. 10 finds, 1 continent. So what do they say when you put them together? Look closely at these 10 sites, and a hidden pattern appears. It is not really a pattern of what was found. It is a pattern of how anything survived at all. And almost every case comes down to one enemy being defeated. That enemy is oxygen. At Little Salt Spring, at Page-Ladson, and in Naia's flooded chamber, the deep water holds almost no oxygen. Without it, the bacteria that drive decay simply cannot function. So wood, bone, hair, and even brain tissue endure for thousands of years. At Ozette, a sudden mudslide sealed a whole village in dense, oxygen-free clay, freezing a single moment in time. At Lovelock, it was the opposite condition, the bone-dry air of a desert cave that desiccated flesh into mummies. And at Hueyatlaco and Folsom, rapid burial in fine sediment locked stone tools tightly against ancient bone. Each of these methods captures a different slice of the ancient world. Cold, dark, mineral-rich water even grows protective calcite crusts over bone, which is exactly what let scientists date Naia. This is why perishable finds, a wooden throwing stick, a whale fin carving, the world's oldest duck decoys, feel almost like magic. They are the rare survivors. The overwhelming majority of prehistory, all the wood and cloth and flesh, has rotted completely away, which badly biases what we are able to know. There is a cruel trade-off hidden here. The best preserved sites are almost always the hardest and most dangerous to reach, sealed underwater, or buried under tons of earth. And the story of Lovelock is a warning of what happens without care when guano miners shoveled away priceless context for fertilizer. These sites are not typical. They are statistical miracles. And notice the deeper link. It is catastrophe itself, the flood, the mudslide, the fatal fall, that freezes time and preserves the moment. Disaster is the great archivist, which raises a harder question about what these preserved moments actually show us, because so many of them are moments of death. The finds in this video are soaked in death, but not all death is the same. There is a vast difference between the 10 meters of crushed bone at Head Smashed In and the single tortoise impaled at Little Salt Spring. One is industrial, the other is intimate. Head Smashed In represents mass killing on a scale that ran for 6,000 years. Herd after herd driven off a cliff by hundreds of coordinated people. The impaled tortoise is the trace of one animal, one hunter, one afternoon. Folsom and Page-Ladson sit somewhere in between, the hunting of enormous, dangerous megafauna, mastodons and giant bison, which demanded cooperation and courage. What unites them all is intelligence. The drive lanes marked by 12,000 cairns, the fire-hardened stake shaped to pierce a shell, the fluted point crafted at high risk of breaking. This is engineering, not savagery. There is also technology aimed purely at squeezing out survival. The stone-boiling pits at the Buffalo Jump rendered grease from bone, an exhausting process to extract every last calorie. And the line between food and ceremony often blurs. The Lovelock legend speaks of a massacre, a memory perhaps of real conflict between groups. Naia's skeleton, malnourished and marked by physical stress, reminds us that daily survival was itself brutal, long before anyone raised a weapon against a neighbor. Notice, too, the strange arithmetic of these sites. Animal death is everywhere, in bone beds meters deep, while actual human remains are scarce and precious. The extinct megafauna served a double role. They were the prey, and then their very bodies became the medium of preservation. The tusk that held the cut marks, the ribs that held the spear point. The butchery marks themselves are a language. They tell us which tools were used, how skilled the hands were, and even how weapons evolved, as the atlatl gave way to the bow. Consider the sheer numbers again. A single drive at head smashed in could bring down dozens or even hundreds of animals at once, and every carcass then had to be skinned, cut, and rendered before it spoiled. That was not the work of a few hunters. It was the work of an entire community, and the hunt itself became the thread that bound people together, year after year, generation after generation. Death sites, in the end, are our richest windows into the living, which forces the biggest question of all. Who exactly were these people? For most of the 20th century, there was a single, confident answer to when people reached the Americas. It was called the Clovis First Model, and it set a firm ceiling of about 12,000 years ago. Several finds in this video took a hammer to that ceiling. Page-Ladson, with its butchered mastodon tusk dated to 14,550 years ago, punched cleanly through the wall, proving people were here a millennium and a half before Clovis. And at the far extreme edge sits Hueyatlaco, with its impossible quarter-million-year outlier that most scientists still cannot accept. Between those two lies the new mainstream frontier of pre-Clovis sites, places like White Sands in New Mexico and Monteverde in Chile, which have pushed solid dates back to somewhere between 15,000 and 23,000 years ago. Naia added a different kind of correction. For years, the odd, narrow shape of the earliest American skulls made some researchers think the first Americans were a separate population, later replaced by the ancestors of modern Native Americans. Naia's DNA, belonging to the Beringian haplogroup D1, proved they were the same lineage all along. The face changed. The bloodline did not. Underwater sites, it turns out, have been quietly doing much of the work of pushing these dates back, precisely because they preserve what dry land destroys. There is a human pattern here too, and it is not flattering. Folsom itself shows how a single find can set a consensus in stone, and then how the next find can shatter it. And the story of Virginia Steen McIntyre at Hueyatlaco shows the cost of being right too early, or of reporting a date the field was not ready to hear. The hard part is telling a genuine anomaly apart from simple contamination, and that judgment is not always made on the evidence alone. Consensus in archaeology does not shift cleanly. It resists, it argues, and eventually it moves. The record forces humility on everyone who dares to say the word first. And still, so much of it refuses to be explained at all. For all the science, all the dating methods, and DNA, these sites are still stacked with unanswered questions, and honesty demands that we sit with them rather than paper over them. We do not know the true age of the Serpent Mound. We do not know for certain who built it, the Adena or the Fort Ancient people, with credible studies pointing in both directions across more than 1,000 years. We do not fully know why the hunter-gatherers of Watson Brake raised 11 mounds when, by every old assumption, they should not have had the organization to do it. We do not know the real age of the Hueyatlaco tools, only that 4 dating methods once agreed on a number no one wanted. We cannot be sure whether Naia simply fell in the dark, or whether something else brought her to the bottom of that pit. We do not know for certain what triggered the mudslide that swallowed Ozette, whether it was rain or the Great Cascadia earthquake of 1700. We do not know the full purpose of the deep ledges at Little Salt Spring, or the truth hiding inside the Lovelock giant legend, or why the Serpent Mound was placed so precisely on the rim of an ancient crater. Part of the problem is the material itself. Perishable finds and disturbed sites are extraordinarily hard to date with confidence, and a site like Lovelock, where miners shoveled out 250 tons of guano before any scientist arrived, may have lost its answers forever. Every one of these gaps deserves to be treated with curiosity rather than dismissal. The mainstream explanation, the archaeological reading, and the fringe speculation each capture something, and each can be wrong. There is real tension between what oral traditions remember and what excavation reveals, and the wise approach listens to both. Some finds are still held back from public display entirely, tied up by law, by dispute, or by respect for the dead. And we should always remember that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. What has rotted away, what was shoveled out as fertilizer, what still lies unreached in the dark, may hold the very answers we are missing. Step back from all 10 sites, and one image ties them together. Again and again, it was catastrophe that kept the memory. The flood that exposed the Folsom bones, the mudslide that sealed Ozette, the fatal fall that placed Naia beyond the reach of decay. Disaster did not erase these moments. It preserved them. And that is the humbling thing. Each site is only a single frozen instant, not a whole story. A tortoise on a ledge, a spear point in a rib, a village caught mid-breath. We reconstruct entire worlds from these tiny accidental survivals. Behind each one stand the people who found them, and so many of them are forgotten. A self-taught cowboy who died before his discovery was understood. Divers feeling their way through black, alligator-haunted water. Even the miners who, without meaning to, uncovered a cave full of the past before they wrecked it. The same continent, the same ground, holds all of it at once. Stone tools and human bodies, giant earthworks and desert legends, industrial death pits, and quiet ceremonial mounds. And running through the whole record is a debt, owed to the indigenous oral traditions that so often remembered the truth first, and to the partnerships, like the Maca at Ozette, that now shape how these places are studied and honored. What survives is only a tiny, biased sliver of everything that once was. That should not discourage us. It should keep us humble, because this is a record that keeps overturning itself, pushing dates back, dissolving old certainties, revealing that the first people here were older, cleverer, and stranger than we assumed. The horror and the wonder of these finds are two faces of the same thing. And the next flood, the next dive, the next careful scrape of a trowel may expose something that rewrites all of it again. We are standing on a deep archive that is still being read. The ground remembers far more than we do.